To wrap up talking about complex experimental designs, we're going to talk about looking at them graphically in different figures. So one kind of rule that you don't always want to go by, again, the main way you want to interpret interactions is by doing statistical tests. But if you're just looking at some sort of figures, if you see lines that look like they're going to cross or actually do cross, that is generally going to indicate that there is some kind of interaction. So if we look at how we might plot the data from the Bazzini and Schaefer study, the dating and attractiveness, or like dating status and attractiveness of a hypothetical person study, this is how it would look. We have, if they're attracted to your friend, remember there's not really much of a difference there at all. If they are attracted to the participant themselves, there is a much bigger difference here. So what do we do with this information? Well, you can see that these lines are basically already crossing. They would cross if these lines were extended out a bit. So that indicates there probably is some kind of interaction here. A lot of times people will describe this as being like a Pac-Man mouth or an alligator mouth or something like that. So if you see that kind of shape or an X, that's generally going to be an interaction. So what does this really mean? If there is an interaction, then most of the time you are going to kind of ignore the main effects in a sense. The interaction is going to be kind of the meat of your discussion of what your results are like. So if you do have a significant interaction, you talk about the simple effects, or alternatively, there's something else called simple slopes that we're not going to get into in this video or this unit. We'll just talk about simple effects. That's a little bit more straightforward. If there is no significant interaction, then you would want to talk about the relevant main effects, right? You'd want to talk about the differences between the conditions of one of your independent variables that really seem to matter. But if there is a significant interaction, again, you want to do something different. We're going to talk about looking at simple effects. So what are simple effects? Well, they're just looking at the mean differences of relevant cells or conditions in these studies. So if you are looking at this one, you would have four possible simple effects that would be relevant. The effect of dating status for stranger, uh, uh, attracted to friend condition. So how much does dating status matter in the stranger attracted to friend condition? How much does dating status matter in the stranger attracted to self condition? How much does type of scenario matter for exclusive daters? How much does type of scenario matter for non-exclusive daters? So if you kind of can reference back and forth, if you're looking at this on your own with these different numbers I have here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, I have these represented here, these comparisons on, the means we've been looking at this whole time. So how much does dating status here matter when it's about a friend? How much does dating status matter when it's attraction to the participant? How much does scenario matter for exclusive daters, and how much does scenario matter for non-exclusive daters? These all might tell us something important about the interaction between these variables. And then we can look at what these things would look like on the figure itself. So the simple effect for dating status for the stranger attracted to friend condition, looks like there's no significant difference here. These means are very, very close to one another. No significant simple effect here. If we look over at dating status for stranger attracted to self, then you see our biggest difference here. There is a significant difference between these two. Now, the way that you're going to view these is going to depend on how you plot them, which independent variable is on the x-axis and which independent variable is represented by the different lines. The other two simple effects are within a given line, for example. You see and these ones would not be statistically significant on their own. So the only statistically significant simple effect in these in this study is this one here. And if you just kind of eyeball this, this might have been your conclusion anyway, right? That this is the big difference that's really important, and none of the other mean differences really mattered all that much. Now, I mentioned that I'm not going to go into too much detail about simple slopes. Simple slopes would be basically looking at the slopes of these lines and telling if they were significantly uh, different from zero, basically. So that's a little bit of a different way to test these things, and that again kind of depends on which one you're going to represent as lines and which one you're going to represent on the x-axis. But as far as simple effects go, you'd again have four that you're looking at here, and only one of them would have been significant. So if we kind of take another step back again, what does all this mean? Bazzini and Schaefer had a statistically significant dating status by type of scenario interaction effect. And their interpretation then is going to be that your romantic interest not only depends on dating status of an individual, but it depends on dating status of an individual and who the potential dating partner is interested in. So it's not just that one matters, and it's not that potential dating partner interest doesn't matter at all. It's that it matters depending on the dating status of the other person. So, without studying both of these variables, you wouldn't have had as nuanced of an idea about how they really fit in together. Okay, a couple other things I just want to emphasize about looking at these different figures. You want to think about how you're going to graph these different results. Again, you've noticed at this point that those cell means, like each of those conditions means, you plot them on the graph. The dV is going to be on the y-axis, so the vertical axis, higher values being higher scores on your dependent variable. One variable, as you've seen, is on the x-axis, the horizontal one. That could be true if you have two variables like we've seen, or many levels of that independent variable. The other independent variable is going to be represented by the lines, as we've gone over. And if you have more than two independent variables, then that's going to necessitate either you inventing a way to graph things in 3 or 4 dimensions, or you just make multiple graphs and show, here is my two-way interaction on this level of my third variable, and here is a two-way interaction on my other level of my third variable. So this gets more and more complicated rather quickly. Again, we've talked about interpreting what these things look like on graphs, but I want to give you a few more examples. So if you're just looking at a graph and trying to figure out what the main effect is like, then you're going to look at the midpoint between different cell means to be able to compare them. And I'll go through this on a couple examples in a second, but you're going to notice that this is something you just kind of have to eyeball if you're just looking at the graphs here. So, sorry, I thought I had an example here, but I'll get back to that in just a second. So, if you are just looking at the graphs again, we've talked about if they're crossing or converging, then that's going to indicate that there is an interaction. If there is no interaction, then the lines are going to be parallel with one another, whether it's, that they're both going up and down, that they're completely horizontal. If they're not crossing one another, that basically means there is not an interaction. But it can be difficult really to interpret when there is an interaction, when there isn't. So let's think about what the main effects on this particular study would be like. So we're looking at the number of poor mental health days according to two independent variables: the sex of the respondent, male or female, and if the respondent has ever been divorced, yes or no. So we have divorce on the x-axis here horizontally, and we have respondent sex on the different lines here. And higher numbers here are higher numbers of poor mental health days. So if we wanted to look at the main effect of divorce on number of mental health days in the last 90 days, you would look at kind of the midpoints between these cell means. And this is kind of assuming that the cells have relatively equal numbers of participants, but let's just leave that aside for a second. But if you wanted to look at the mean for people that have been divorced, it would be, somewhere in between these two lines here. So maybe 4.7 poor mental health days in the past 30 days. Down here, if you looked at no divorce in their past, the mean is going to be maybe at about 3 of those days in the past 30 days. So you have a reasonably big seeming difference here, and you would conclude that there is a main effect of divorce on poor mental health days. There's a main effect there because you see a pretty big difference in the uh, dependent variable or the height on the y-axis. If you wanted to look at the difference between the main effect of respondent sex, you would again just look at the relevant midpoints. So female is the green line, the midpoint of the way up the green line is going to be about 4 here. And for male, the blue line, the midpoint's going to be about maybe 3.8 or something like that. So that's probably not going to be that big of a difference, probably not significant, right? So you can look at these lines and be able to tell what each of those main effects are by looking at the relevant midpoints between different cell means. Then we might want to interpret, is there an interaction here? These lines, there's a bigger difference here, bigger simple effect here than there is here. These lines, if extended out, would eventually cross. Hard to say. This is kind of a tweener. Maybe there's an interaction, maybe there's not. For one other example, why don't you look at this one, look at these lines, and just think for a moment whether you think there is an interaction or not here. Pause if you want to take another second to think about it. So if you kind of eyeball these, you can see again there does seem to be a main effect between these two variables, maybe not between these ones, and it maybe looks like these lines are going to cross out somewhere in the distance. But maybe this makes you think that there's not an interaction because these seem a little more parallel. What I would say about this though is that this is actually the exact same data that I showed you on the last slide. It's just that I've flipped respondent sex and divorce status. See how those are actually exactly the same? It's just that the lines are between different cell means. They're between different points that are plotted in different places. So this is exactly the same data, but you can see how this looks maybe like there is more clear of an interaction because the lines are closer together, and you can kind of see that they're not as parallel, and this maybe gives the illusion that they are maybe more parallel. So I do this just to point out that how you plot data and how you present it visually can be very impactful. And you can do that to make things clearer, or you can do that to be misleading. So it's very important to think about how you're shaping things, making sure that you're not trying to, juice your own claims by picking a way of presenting them that's more convincing or something. You're just doing it in the way that's the most intuitive, basically. If we actually ran an ANOVA to see what the results were there, divorce, sex, and the interaction between divorce and respondent sex, we would actually see that there is not a significant interaction there. Really low F value here, just a little above 0.1, and the significance, the P value here is relatively high. So that actually was not a significant interaction there. And the main effects, we shouldn't interpret these necessarily. They're a little distorted, but unsurprisingly, you see that divorce in this model is very significant because we, saw that there was that big main effect that we observed there. Okay, another one that might be useful to look at just to get a little more practice interpreting these main effects and interactions. This one is poor physical health days in the past 30 days if you've ever been widowed and broken down by sex. So main effect here, let's say the main effect of male versus female first. Men average of maybe about 7.2 days, women average of about 3.8, let's say. So that seems like a pretty big effect of respondent sex. If you've ever been widowed, if we look at the means of those, they're really, really probably pretty close together, maybe at about 6 and 5.5. So we might think then there's not a main effect of whether someone has been widowed or not. But that doesn't mean that whether you've been widowed doesn't matter at all, right? because if we look at the interaction between these, it seems that there are differential effects for men and women. It seems that being widowed for men really increases or is associated with an increase in the number of poor physical health days when it's associated with a decrease in the number of physical health days, poor physical health days for women. So maybe a little more complex main effects and interactions here. And again, if you flip this data around a little bit and show it in a different way, you might see then, it's just as clearly an interaction, but maybe it's clearer in this figure to see that there's no main effects of being widowed. The mean maybe around here versus here. The midpoints between those lines. So again, just showing you again that the data can kind of look differently depending on how you feel like presenting it. And it just might be differences in what variable you feel like is the moderator or accentuates the point that you're making. And if we did an actual ANOVA on that, unsurprisingly, that seemed like a pretty clear interaction, right? The interaction between sex and whether you were widowed was significant in its interaction there. One other thing to note, that usually when you are plotting interactions, we've been talking about things that mostly just have two conditions on each independent variable. But if you have variables with more conditions, generally the variable with fewer conditions or levels is going to be plotted as a line. So this one here, you have all these different lines. This gets a little bit muddied, and it's a little clearer what's going on here if you plot the variable with only two levels as two different lines. Just generally, you don't want to have a bunch of a bunch of lines muddying up your plot, and it can be a little clearer if you go a little bit of a simpler route there. All right, so that wraps up complex experimental designs, and thanks.